and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on the programme, the Israeli president receives a letter from President Trump asking him to pardon Prime Minister Netanyahu. We ask, how does President Herzog respond to that? Plus, we'll have all the latest on the general election in Iraq, which drew an unexpectedly high turnout of more than 55%. We ask who's likely to emerge as the country's next Prime Minister, and why were these elections in Iraq so pivotal? Hello and welcome to the programme. The US President Donald Trump has written to his Israeli counterpart, President Isaac Herzog, with a formal request for him to pardon the Israeli Prime Minister. Well, President Trump described Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as a formidable and decisive wartime prime minister, whom he said was leading Israel into a time of peace. Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu faces charges of fraud, bribery and breach of trust in 3 separate cases. Well, he has entered a plea of not guilty and maintains his innocence. Now to our next story today. Iraq on Tuesday held its 6th parliamentary election since the fall of Saddam Hussein. Well, more than 12 million eligible voters cast their ballots to determine who will win the 329 parliamentary seats up for grabs. Well, according to the Independent High Electoral Commission, that is a turnout of more than 55%, a sharp increase from the last elections 4 years ago. Well, more than 180,000 security personnel were deployed to ensure that voting went off smoothly, which it appears to have done. Preliminary results are now starting to come in, and they appear to show that the list backing the incumbent Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani has come out on top. Well, let's get more. We can speak now to Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, who is Israel's Special Envoy for Trade and Innovation, who joins us now from Jerusalem. Fleur, always a pleasure talking to you. I'd like to start by asking you about this letter that President Trump has written to his Israeli counterpart, President Isaac Herzog, asking for a full pardon for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in his ongoing trial. Why do you think President Trump has sent this letter?
Great question. As you know, in his speech in the Knesset a few weeks ago, he literally put the president on the spot and said to him in front of the entire Knesset and the entire world, oh, come on, why don't you pardon him? And we thought that would be the end of it. But he wrote a proper letter. And I think the main motivation is that Trump can't understand how a wartime prime minister is having to go to court 3 times a week in the middle of a really very difficult few years in the state of Israel, as you well know, in order to face charges which started off being bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. And now, basically, the judges have indicated that the bribery charge has absolutely no legs. And then the fraud and breach of trust is also being proven very difficult in court. Some of the witnesses for the prosecution didn't turn out to be as convincing as anybody thought. And so I think that President Trump, knowing the challenges ahead, the challenges what's going on in Gaza right now, how Hezbollah are strengthening themselves in Lebanon, the ongoing problem with the Houthis and everything else that Israel is facing in the region, why on earth does a prime minister have to be wasting his precious time in a courtroom 3 times a week? I think that's probably his motivation.
OK, and the opposition would say to you and to that line of argument, if Prime Minister Netanyahu can't do the job because he's tied up with other issues, then he should resign.
Well, the counter-argument is that that's exactly what this was about, that this is these are politically motivated cases. And the aim of these cases is exactly that, to get him to resign. And that opens up the whole Pandora's box of the deep state in Israel and of the judiciary in Israel being politicized and being controlled by the left. So there's a huge Pandora's box here. I mean, you could argue it one way, you could argue the other way as well.
So what's President Herzog going to do? He's in this very difficult situation, isn't he, where he's going to have those inside Israel saying, you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu should be subject to the full weight of the law in the same way that every other Israeli citizen is. And there'll be those like you and perhaps others. We've heard, for example, from the National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir saying absolutely he should be let off the hook. What does President Herzog do?
What President Herzog actually has already done, he's following procedure. And he's written back to President Trump and said, I will consider it if Netanyahu, which is what normally happens, if you want a pardon, you have to apply for a pardon. So he's quite clever because he said, I'll consider a pardon if he goes through the procedure of applying for a pardon. But then that puts Prime Minister Netanyahu in a spot, because you apply for a pardon, it's essentially an admission of guilt. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has not pleaded guilty, does not believe that he's guilty of anything. And so I think he's in a catch-22. And President Herzog has done what is procedurally correct to do.
Right, and that's what the opposition leader Yair Lapid said, that for this idea to work, for President Trump's request for President Herzog to simply pardon Netanyahu, he would have to admit that he broke the law. Doesn't sound like you think he's likely to do that, because I assume that could then have repercussions for him later on down the line, were new cases to be brought against him.
No, I actually think that if he does ask for a pardon, there would be an arrangement so that this is it. I don't think anybody would put themselves in that corner. But I think that for Prime Minister Netanyahu, who still claims that all of these are trumped-up charges, that all of these are politicized, that this is what happens with the public prosecution in Israel, that there are examples in the past of this happening before, and that I think it would be a very difficult thing for him to do, because that would indeed be an admission of guilt and asking to be pardoned for that guilt. And I'm not sure that that's something that Prime Minister Netanyahu is ready to do. And I'm not sure he's wrong.
There are, obviously lots of theories doing the rounds as to why President Trump wrote this letter. I know they're only theories, and all we can do is speculate at this stage. But there are those who think that if Prime Minister Netanyahu is pardoned, he'll somehow be more amenable to Washington. What do you make of that argument?
I don't think that's a strong argument, because Prime Minister Netanyahu already is amenable to Washington. I mean, you've seen the last few weeks. You've seen how President Trump essentially forced this ceasefire on all parties. There's enormous pressure right now on Israel to release those murderous terrorists stuck in that tunnel, something that Israel has not wanted to do. Israel says you give in, you give up, you give yourselves up, or you die in those tunnels. And there's a big push from Washington to create some type of a model or a pilot for disarmament and letting these terrorists go, which is something very difficult for Israel. So I don't think it's this letter that'll somehow convince Prime Minister Netanyahu to do something that Washington wants him to do that he's not already convinced. Israel and the United States are strong allies. We know that the United States has our back, and that is extremely important to us, especially with what's going on in the region right now.
Obviously, Prime Minister Netanyahu's opponents are opposed to the idea of Netanyahu being simply given a pardon. I'm just wondering more broadly amongst the Israeli population, how has it gone down that the president of another country has written to the president of that country, essentially asking for the legal system to make some dispensation for one of the people in that country? Are there people there saying this is interference in our legal affairs?
Well, the thing is that Israel, as you know, is very divided, a little bit like the United States, with the people who love Trump and the people who hate Trump. So in Israel, we have a similar situation. There are people who love Netanyahu, will walk through fire for him. And there are people who absolutely hate him and think that he's what's wrong with everything in Israel. And so that's the division. And I would guess, I would make an intelligent guess, that the people who love Netanyahu are very pleased with this letter and are saying, well done. And the people who hate him are saying this is interference.
OK, and do you think there is a chance that somehow Prime Minister Netanyahu asked President Trump to do this and send this letter?
You know, you never know. There is a possibility that happened. I've got to say, though, that in the Knesset speech, I think that we can all agree the way that it rolled out, that it was very spontaneous. Everybody was shocked, including Netanyahu. You could see it in his face. So I think that what started this all was President Trump in one of his off-the-cuff comments, which he obviously felt, and this has rolled into this. So who knows if this letter was something that Prime Minister Netanyahu lobbied for. But I definitely think that when he mentioned it in his speech, that was definitely something that came from President Trump, seeing the reality of what Israel is going through, what its leadership is going through, the status quo in the region, and wanting to kind of help out.
Obviously, elections are coming up next year in Israel. We don't know exactly when they're going to happen. I'd love to get your insights as to what month you think they're most likely to happen in. But do you think this letter and any eventual pardon has any significant bearing on how those elections are conducted?
Well, it's very interesting because Prime Minister Netanyahu, under the cloud of this indictment, has run a number of elections that he's won. I mean, except for one, he's won all of them. So it seems to me that the elections have absolutely no bearing in the fact that Netanyahu was indicted and he's going to court a few times a week and these cases are ongoing. And in fact, I think it strengthens his position of saying that these are trumped-up charges, that these are politicized charges. The fact that the judges themselves said, listen, the bribery charge, which is the most serious of the charges, has not much to stand on. There's not much holding that charge up, that which strengthens it. So I don't think it has a bearing on the election. Of course, I'm sure that Prime Minister Netanyahu would love nothing more than run an election when he doesn't have to face any more charges. But I really don't think it has any bearing on the election. In terms of when the election is going to be, well, there has to be elections by September 26th. I reckon it'll be more like June.
Okay, middle of next year. There are these three separate cases that Prime Minister Netanyahu faces. Just remind us, what does he face by way of possible consequences in these trials?
So the three major charges were fraud, breach of trust, and bribery. The bribery charge, as I mentioned, doesn't really have much of a chance of standing. It's about him trying to essentially buy favors from one of the main newspapers in Israel. And many of us really believe, I'm a lawyer by profession, that there's never been, they've kind of invented a crime. Bribery is never about anything other than money or something material. And in this case, it didn't even happen. So it's an attempted bribery on an invented charge, which is favorable coverage in a newspaper. So that's more or less fallen through the wastewater. What we have is fraud and breach of trust. And again, we're talking about champagne and cigars that Arnon Milchan, this billionaire, gave him and his wife. Again, people are not taking this particularly seriously. We're not talking about private jets or houses. We're talking about champagne and cigars. So I think, again, even if this is proven to be true, how serious can it be that a prime minister receives a gift of cigars from a friend? And so these are the charges. And even if he faces, in the end, breach of trust and fraud, we're looking at any sentence anywhere from a suspended sentence to 6 to 12 months. I don't see Prime Minister Netanyahu doing any jail time for any of this if it is proven to be something that the judges think he did.
Okay, so you're basically saying that the worst outcome that Prime Minister Netanyahu faces is simply wastage of time and distraction from his day-to-day work, and not the likelihood of him facing time behind bars?
I don't think so. I think it would be very unlikely that for these charges, who he is and the circumstances, he'd end up in jail. I mean, look, we've had Prime Minister Olmert in jail, but he was proven to have taken bribes, and so this has nothing to do with that. And like I said, the bribery charges have the judges have basically said that they really don't hold any water.
Just on a sort of separate note, I'm just wondering what the sense is in Israel at the moment, just because we haven't talked about it much. We've been focused on the elections in Iraq. We've been focused on the visit by the Syrian president to Washington this week. What's the sense about how the ceasefire is doing, how it's holding? What's the latest on that, Fleur?
Well, look, it's holding by a string. We've got, unfortunately, 4 dead hostages that still haven't returned. I want to remind everyone that the original agreement, all the hostages, dead and alive, were supposed to be returned within 72 hours. We're weeks now after that, and still 4 hostages' bodies in Gaza. And I don't believe for a second they don't know where they are. And the reason why they're kind of biding for time is that if the first phase of the ceasefire is completed, which is basically the return of all the hostages, they have to go into the second stage. And the second stage is disarmament. Now, a terrorist, genocidal, Muslim Brotherhood group like Hamas, disarmament is basically the end of who they are. They are terrorists. This is their raison d'etre. And I think that the reason why they're drib-drabbing this is because they don't want to get to the second phase of having to disarm. At the same time, I don't see any authority making them disarm. And so I really don't know what's going to happen to the second phase of this ceasefire. Listen, we all pray for the ceasefire to stick. But unfortunately, we see that Hamas is regaining its power and rearming itself. Only 2 days ago, we had a report of a drone bringing in arms all the way from Egypt. So I don't hold much hope that this is the solution unless there's a way of making sure that Hamas does not govern Gaza. This is only a temporary ceasefire.
Okay, well, we appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much indeed. Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, Israel's Special Envoy for Trade and Innovation. Thanks for your time. Well, for more, we can speak now to Hady Amr, who is a former U.S. Special Representative for Palestinian Affairs who served under President Biden. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. As ever, Hady, great to have you with us. We're in a situation where President Trump has written to his Israeli counterpart asking for the Israeli president to grant a full pardon to Prime Minister Netanyahu in his ongoing corruption trial. And I'd like to start by asking you, why do you think President Trump has sent this letter?
Well, there's a lot to unpack here, and thank you for having me. So first of all, Trump is obviously obsessed with trials and impeachments of presidents, given his own experience in government and out of government. And so, and when we talk about the charges, you'll see why. Netanyahu is charged, and by the way, the investigations began 10 years ago, long before the current slaughter in Gaza began. But the investigations began 10 years ago in bribery, receiving champagne and cigars for political favors, fraud, for negotiating with the newspaper for favorable coverage, regulatory favors to a communications group for better media coverage. And these charges could carry, 10 years in prison. So, I think Donald Trump sees a lot of himself in Benjamin Netanyahu.
Okay. What's the idea, therefore, by getting him pardoned? Does that mean, were he to be pardoned, he'd be more amenable to Washington?
Well, so excellent question. And what I want to say is, while I have zero evidence for this, what I surmise in getting into Trump's head and the negotiator's head is that he's trying to get Netanyahu pardoned on these longstanding corruption charges so that he can pressure Netanyahu to make concessions as they relate to Trump's quest for a Nobel Peace Prize, right? Concessions related to Gaza, to Palestine, to maybe doing what Saudi Arabia wants so he can, get Saudi Arabia in the Abraham Accords, maybe even releasing the longstanding Palestinian prisoner Barghouti from prison. So this although it's perhaps a reprehensible tactic, it could actually be effective in some ways.
Okay, and where does this leave the president of Israel? How does he respond to this? Because, what we've heard so far sounds like a pretty sort of procedural, a dry sort of a response. I think his officer says anyone who seeks a pardon must submit a formal request in accordance with the established procedures. Does it sound to you like he's going to play ball here?
Well, look, we'll get to that in a second. But my question is, does Netanyahu even want a pardon? Because the Israeli system is very different than the American system. In the American system, a president can issue a pardon without that person, kind of expressing any guilt. In the Israeli system, Netanyahu would have to say he did something wrong. Does he even want to admit he's done something wrong? He spent the last decade saying the trial is a sham, and it's never going to go through because it's false. So this would be a kind of a complete reversal for Netanyahu. So that's the first thing. The second thing, would Herzog go along? Maybe, if he thought he could make a political deal to get Netanyahu off the scene and get this kind of toxic player, which more than half Israeli society thinks is a toxic player in Israeli society, to just kind of get him off the scene. And by the way, that's less to do with Gaza and more to do with internal Israeli politics.
Right. And what do you think President Trump's desired outcome is with regards to Netanyahu? Does a pardon mean he'll have more Netanyahu or less Netanyahu?
I don't know if they've thought that through. I think what he wants is something from Netanyahu, right? So I think what Trump wants is, I can only imagine, again, and I have zero evidence for this, that there's a conversation that Trump says to Netanyahu, look, I'm going to get you a pardon. I'm going to get all of your legal troubles to go away. You don't have to worry about going to prison any longer, or at least in the U.S. I mean, at least in Israel. But he'll want to get a concession on Palestine, a concession that says, I'm going to release these, high-profile Palestinian prisoners, or you're going to say you support two states to an extent that is good enough for Saudi Arabia to come into the Abraham Accords. But I think from an Israeli perspective, what I think Herzog would be interested in, and other kind of Israeli politicians would be interested in, is they'd be okay with a pardon if Netanyahu both admitted guilt and agreed to leave the political scene in Israel. So I think it would be a two-step payment by Netanyahu. Step one would be a political a statement or move before leaving, getting the pardon, and then for the Israeli system, an agreement to leave the political scene if he did get the pardon. But I don't know that Netanyahu actually wants those things, to be honest with you. But I'm not sure. I've got no evidence. I'm not behind the scenes anymore. As you can see, I'm joining you from my home here outside of Washington, D.C. So.
Yeah, I mean, we're speculating, obviously, and none of us is party to any information. So all we can do is try to decrypt the few facts we have. I mean, I want to ask you another thing. I mean, so it doesn't sound to me like you think necessarily Prime Minister Netanyahu put President Trump up to this and made this request in one of their sets of talks. One other thing that was occurring to me while I was listening to you is, throughout the 24 months of warfare in Gaza, there was this idea that Prime Minister Netanyahu wanted the war to go on for as long as possible, because the longer the war went on, the further down the road he kicked the can with regards to his legal woes. So if his legal woes have gone away, does that mean a much reduced risk of Israel suddenly deciding to reignite that war in Gaza? Because why would Prime Minister Netanyahu want to do that?
Look, so that's actually that's an interesting thought, and kudos on you for that. But I don't know. I think that Netanyahu. I think he also wants to continue the war because he thinks it emboldens his electoral prospects as well, right? We've got Israeli elections coming up in 11 months or less, and I think he thinks that the military conflict might help him in elections. In fact, I don't think he wanted to make this peace deal. I think he got pressured by Trump to do it. So that could be, what you're surmising could be entirely accurate as well. So it could have that kind of effect.
I think, one of the things that struck me when I read the letter that President Trump sent to President Herzog, he wrote this line: "I absolutely respect the independence of the Israeli justice system and its requirements. But," he said, "I believe this case against Netanyahu is political, unjustified prosecution." And I'm wondering how that's going to go down in Israel, where, let's be clear, especially for our viewers, I mean, Netanyahu does not enjoy universal support from the Israeli public. How are the Israelis en masse likely to view a request for someone that they don't particularly love en masse to be pardoned before his legal process is even wrapped up?
Look, I think there's two dimensions to that, right? I think the Netanyahu supporters will obviously be thrilled with Donald Trump for saying that, but I think that, the Netanyahu detractors will be appalled by this, and those in the middle might kind of be in the middle. But what I think is, so I think that's how I would frame it. But again, for my sense of what, other than from Netanyahu's supporters, again, the pardon, as I understand it, would require Netanyahu to admit guilt. And what I understand from the broader Israeli society is they'd only really be interested in this if Netanyahu actually agreed to leave the scene and step away from politics. So I don't think you get, from domestic Israeli political considerations, I don't think you get the pardon without that agreement from Netanyahu to leave the scene politically. You don't get it legally without him admitting guilt.
Okay, and obviously within Israel, there are obviously the supporters of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Not surprisingly, we've heard from the National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who says that President Herzog must agree to this. And he's absolutely in support of the notion that this is all a political piece of witch hunting. So presumably there is considerable pressure on Herzog either way. The president is stuck in the middle, those saying do not agree to this, and those saying, like Ben-Gvir, absolutely agree to it. I mean, which way does he go?
Well, look, I actually don't think that Ben-Gvir really wields a lot of political pressure on the president. Ben-Gvir is a ultra-nationalist, right-wing, fringe politician, one with significant power in Israel, but only on the hard right within Israel, and he doesn't really curry any favor with Herzog. So Ben-Gvir. What Ben-Gvir wants is the ultimate deal for Netanyahu, which is one where he gets this pardon and it doesn't have to leave political life in Israel. I just don't think I think there's a much bigger critical mass in Israel that might say to Herzog, hey, if you can get a deal that we don't have to see Netanyahu on TV anymore, fine, give him the pardon. It's worth the price to get rid of him, get rid of him politically. But that's not what Ben-Gvir wants. Ben-Gvir wants to, as he wants with everything, right? As he wants with Al-Aqsa, as he wants, he wants to have his cake and eat it too. Netanyahu, and that's also what Netanyahu wants. I just don't think that Herzog will ever agree to a pardon without Bibi admitting guilt and without him agreeing to leave the scene.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us, helping us decrypt these complicated events. Hady Amr, former U.S. Special Representative for Palestinian Affairs under President Biden. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now to our next story today. Iraq on Tuesday held its 6th parliamentary election since the fall of Saddam Hussein, while more than 12 million eligible voters cast their ballots to determine who will win the 329 parliamentary seats up for grabs. Well, according to the Independent High Electoral Commission, that is a turnout of more than 55%, a sharp increase from the last elections 4 years ago. Well, more than 180,000 security personnel were deployed to ensure that voting went off smoothly, which it appears to have done. Preliminary results are now starting to come in, and they appear to show that the list backing the incumbent Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani has come out on top. Well, we're joined now by Ahmed Roshdy, who is a political analyst who joins us now from Baghdad. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Roshdy. Really appreciate it. I'm just wondering what you're hearing at this stage with regards to early results and projections from this election.
Well, Tom, first of all, it looks like that the Prime Minister list got the biggest number of votes, especially in Baghdad and maybe other Sunni governorates. He took the majority there also. In Salahuddin, he took the majority, maybe in Nineveh also. The most important thing is that the second one is Halbusi, it's Taqaddum. And the third one is Maliki. But at the same time, all those results subjected to something was very awkward, is that the turnout is 56%, which is something very rare can be believed in a way or another, because in 2021 we got about 41% or maybe 43% as a turnout from the elections of 2021, and the Sadrists were there participating in the elections. So how come it become 56% when the Sadrists boycott the elections? It looks very weird, this thing, and maybe after the announcement of the results tonight, which I think it will be postponed until 10 p.m. or something like that. Maybe there will be some sort of suspicious thoughts will be wandering around about the results of the votes, depending on the turnout persons.
Okay, but I mean, we spoke to electoral officials yesterday who told us that there were iris scanning machines installed and that the scope for any kind of fraudulent activity with this vote was reduced to a very, very small percentage. Is that something you think sounds right to you?
No, it's right. They are talking right. But the problem is that how you make the equation. They said that the participation happened by 12 million Iraqis. So who is eligible to participate in the elections? I think it's more than 35 million, something like that. So if you make the equation from those who only have the biometric cards, that means you're going to make the equation on 20 million, not 35 million. So obviously it will have about 56% of participation. This is the trick that I think it's not right. It's supposed to be more transparent, and it's supposed to be. IHAC say to the Iraqis is that the percentage is lower than 35% or something like that. This is the normal participation that happened since 2018, which the down road happened, or let's say the decrease of the participation happened since 2018 because of desperation of Iraqis about the political process and how it can manage normal Iraqi life. So you can imagine if something happened yesterday in the elections, that this turnout observed, or let's say discovered by Iraqis, it's not right. That means just I said, there will be so many suspicious ideas about the results that it will be announced this night.
Okay, so just to summarize, it looks like the turnout percentage is higher this time than it was 4 years ago, but that's because a lower number, but even though a lower number of people took part, it's because eligible voters will be determined to be those who got the biometric card, which is a small fraction, a fraction of the total voting population. Is that right?
Well, those who didn't manage to have their biometric cards, about 15 million people. So it's I think it's a very high number. Eventually, it should. If you're going to calculate the turnout, they should be considered in the turnout, in the final turnout. They should not get outside the equation. This is the main issue. And also, for the scenarios that it's supposed to be happened after day one of elections, or let's say the day of election, the most important thing is that after IHAC will announce the participation turnout, we should have some sort of a view about who get the majority, who get the minority inside the parliament. But the most important thing is that the prime minister, the selection of the prime minister, the president, the speakers, actually in Iraqi politics didn't depend in whole 20 years didn't depend on the numbers of the seats. It's more about power, who gets the power, that will say who is the right person to be the Prime Minister, the President, and the Speaker.
Okay, if we assume that the incumbent Prime Minister, Mohammed Shia al-Sudani, has come top of the list, well, with his list, he's come out on top. Do you think it's going to be a quicker process forming a government this time than it was last time? Because I gather last time, in 2021, it took about a year before a government could actually be formed. Do you think it'll be quicker this time?
I don't think so. I hope so. It will be quicker, but I don't think so, because if Sudani took the majority of the seats inside the ITAR, inside the framework, the Shia framework, that means the struggle inside the ITAR will be very aggressive, especially between Maliki and Sudani. And eventually, if you want to form a government, first of all, you should select a speaker. So the speaker should be selected by whom? By the majority. And the majority is already split between Maliki and Sudani. So how come you're going to select the speaker? If you succeeded to select the speaker, then the parliament should select the president, and which is also a problem, because that means Sunni and Shia and Kurds should be together, reaching about 226 votes, seats to have a president. Then the president will choose the prime minister from those who should be chosen by the political blocs. The most important thing in Iraqi politics, the prime minister never ever have backup from the parliament, which means that even Sudani, he has only 3 MPs when he was elected as a prime minister by the parliament. Voted by the parliament for his government. So you can imagine is that, yes, there is democracy, there is participation in the elections, there is votes, there will be seats in the parliament, but it doesn't mean that it is connected to who going to be the prime minister, the president, and the speaker.
Okay, one of the big words with regards to this election in Iraq, at least from the point of view of the international community, has been Iran, your neighbor. And of course, Washington wants to see and has demanded reduced Iranian influence in Iraq. And yet, Iran-backed political parties and armed factions are understood to have supported the current prime minister. How do you think Washington views that?
Well, Tom, let us be honest. I think Iran wants to negotiate the United States about the situation in Iraq. Just they want to negotiate the U.S. about their nuclear file and so on. So I think what's happened now is go to the ultimate, is that means the prime minister, the president, the speaker will be pro-Iranian, the government will be pro-Iranian, as they are showing those things to the Americans, just to bring them to negotiate. But I don't think the Americans now want to negotiate. I think they will do harsh measurements on any Iraqi government that will put a role for the Hashid, for the Fasal inside it. So you can imagine how much it will be a very difficult time for the formation of the Iraqi government, also for the new government that it will be announced. Let's hope it will be as soon as possible.
It's no coincidence, is it, that when you think about where Iraq sits on the map between Syria and Iran, and the week begun with the new leader of Syria in the Oval Office in Washington, with clear support from Washington, multiple pledges of financial support for the new administration in Syria. Isn't that a bit of a message as well for Iraq, which is, if you engage with Washington, we will treat you as we have treated the Syrian leadership, and your economy will feel some of the effects of that. Do you think that was part of the messaging from Washington?
Yeah, Tom, you are totally right. This is the right message that happened to be sent to the Iraqis, is that don't go forward to have some sort of a high influence of the Iranian inside Iraq, in a way that they can manage to form a government that have Iranian interest first in the first and in the final. So you can imagine, that's what I said, it's very difficult for the new government, if it will be formed soon, it will be very difficult to have some sort of a balanced relationship between Iran and the US. And also, we also know that even the Fasal and the Hashid already have their own MPs inside the new parliament. So if they will have a political blocks inside the parliament, they should have a role in the formation of the new Iraqi government. So you can imagine how much the situation is very complicated to the Iraqis. So I don't know actually how they can manage something like that. It's a very complicated situation. And let us not forget something very important, is that the boycott of Sadr to the elections also, I think it will be a very harsh moment, that if the new government didn't manage to be formed, it will face not only international challenges, but also local challenges like Sadr. So I don't think Sadr will stay calm and see everything happen peacefully to form a new government away from him.
How do you think ordinary Iraqis feel when they think about, obviously they've got concerns of their own, like the unemployment situation, the provision of electricity and basic services. But when you think about the international dimension here and how Iran is increasingly isolated internationally, and perhaps if they went down the path of Syria, they'd be engaged with and embraced by Washington. I mean, do ordinary Iraqis feel like perhaps it's a moment when they choose which way they turn, and would they feel more inclined to turn towards Washington than Tehran?
Well, Tom, honestly, I think we are seeing the same days that happened in 2019, the era before the demonstration of October 2019. Iraq has become desperate, lots of unemployment percent. There is some sort of a geopolitical change in the region. So and there is also pressure from the international community, pressure from the US, in a way or another, to reshape Iraq, politically speaking. So you can imagine all those things can affect ordinary people, ordinary Iraqis. So I will not be surprised if demonstrations will happen again. And I will not be surprised the demonstration will happen by normal Iraqis. Maybe then the Sadr will support them, or maybe the Sadr will begin that, something like that. No one knows. Especially the situation is become more and more complicated.
Washington sounds like it's losing patience. If you listen to some of the messages that have come out of Washington and from the new US envoy to Iraq, it sounds like they really want Iraq to speed up the process of decoupling with Iran and speed up the process of ejecting these pro-Iran militia groups that operate in your country. I mean, what's the feeling in Iraq about what Washington might do if Iraq doesn't take action?
Tom, Iraqis are very afraid, especially if there will be some sort of economical sanctions, that it will affect normal people, normal Iraqi people. And also, let us not forget something very important, is that if the US made a pressure, it's not only it will be on a political, economical, but also on a social level. Why? Because the results maybe, it's not maybe, it's for sure, it's not actually a mirror for what's happening on the societies, on the Iraqi societies. We all know that the participation turnout is not real, so that means Iraqis who boycott the elections, well, let's say about 70% at least, for example, they will have some sort of a feeling is that everything going to stay on that way, corruption will stay on that way, unemployment will stay on that way, and not only that, the infrastructure project will be stopped and so on, because if the US decided to have sanctions on Iraq, because of its relation to Iran. So you can imagine this connection, how between an ordinary Iraqi seeing the whole political scene and try to react on it. So how he can, or let's say how an ordinary Iraqi can react on it, definitely will go for demonstrations, definitely will show in the media and the social media his anger, his rejection for what's happening on the political level. So you can imagine how much the situation will be complicated. That's why I'm saying is that why you go forward to say that the turnout is 56%, because it is actually propagated for ordinary Iraqi who boycott the elections, and they are a lot.
Okay, and so what you're saying is that basically in these elections, a lot of the same old problems have been discussed. There are a lot of the same old faces, but there were also quite a lot of young candidates, weren't there, in this election? And I'm wondering whether that changed anything. Did that change the mood at all going into this election, the fact that there were some young candidates putting their name forwards?
Tom, you mean young candidates who are under the umbrella of the political blocs who already rolled Iraq in 20 years. So you can imagine what is the change. We didn't see independent blocs presented, or let's say show their agenda to the Iraqis, just like what happened in 2021. Never happened on that way. It looks like those who demonstrated in the 2020, in the 2019, in December, in the October 2019, the people who demonstrated, then a political bloc happened to be established on that way and managed to have enroll in the elections of 2021, succeeded to have about 50 seats. Now they are vanished. So you can imagine. That's why I said in the beginning is that I'm seeing the scene of the period prior to the demonstration of October 2019. It looks like that. People furious, all the problems are not solved, saying false numbers about the turnout and so on. The Sadr already boycott, so you can imagine all those problems, how the new Prime Minister can manage it. How an new Iraqi government can manage it. All those issues are very complicated. So that's why I'm saying for the ordinary people and also for young men and women in Iraq, which is about 60% of the Iraqi society, there is no hope. So what are they going to do?
I mean, just to wrap up this conversation, I mean, it doesn't sound like you're very optimistic with regards to the outlook for your country.
Tom, it's not about optimistic or not. It's about reality. We should always focus about what are the chances and what are the challenges. It looks like the challenges are more than the chances. So how it needs someone, or it needs a team that knows how to deal with the situation to try to minimize the challenges and raise up the chances, which I don't see someone who has the capabilities, or a team or some sort of a political blocs, alliances can do something like that. The real or the magical formula is rebuilding the institutions in Iraq, which I don't think someone has such as an agenda in his pocket, and he didn't deliver it before elections. So it's always about ethnicity, it's always about self-interest. So why should Iraqis focus on the next period, for the next days, in a positive way? This is reality. We shouldn't lie about those things in front of our people.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you sharing that with us. Ahmed Roshdy, political analyst in Baghdad. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir. Well, we can speak now to Douglas Silliman, who is the president of the Arab Gulf States Institute and former U.S. ambassador to Iraq. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Ambassador. I'd just like to start by asking you, knowing obviously as you do Baghdad and Washington very well, how closely watched do you think these elections were by the U.S. administration?
I think they were fairly closely watched by parts of the U.S. administration. And I will say that, noting that President Trump, in the past month or so, has appointed a special representative, Mark Savaya, from the Iraqi American community as his representative to Iraq. So it is clear to me that the special envoy is watching the elections very carefully. And I think that that means that there is still interest in the White House in the way that this turns out. That said, the interest in the White House and the interest in President Trump in seeing what the results are in Iraq is a hope that Iraq will move away from Iranian influence and be a little more willing to work with the United States. The president has had great success in the past couple of months in working with the new president of Syria. And I think he would like to have that same kind of success in working with the new government of Iraq.
Right, and looking at Iraq on a map, sandwiched between Syria and Iran, it seems like Iraq's at a bit of a crossroads at the moment. Does it sort of veer towards being a bit more like Syria and engaging with the United States, or does it go deeper into the sphere of influence of Iran? I mean, which way does Iraq turn at this point?
Well, I think that depends a lot on who is actually in the end chosen as prime minister. There are parts of Iraq, particularly in the north among the Christian community, the Kurdish community, and many in the Sunni community, who would like to see a closer relationship between the United States and Iraq. There are many, particularly in the Shia community and south of Baghdad, who, for historical reasons of religious affiliation, family ties, would probably like to see a close relationship with Tehran. And this is the balance that all Iraqi governments have had to make. So I think you're going to see different communities will want different relationships with the United States and Iran. So the choice of prime minister will not be determinative. But if you have a prime minister that will lean one way or another, that might slightly change the direction of where Iraqi government policy is going. If you look at the current prime minister's campaign speeches, Mohammed Shia Sudani, he is trying to take a position that is clearly in the middle between Tehran and Washington, and has said that there is no inherent right for American forces to be in Iraq. So I think he's trying to play both sides, if you will, saying that he would like to maintain Iraq's independence as much as possible from the two countries that probably have the most interest in the outcome, and that is the United States and Iran.
Obviously, the last 12 months, you know this better than anyone, have seen some pretty seismic changes across the region. And I'm just wondering whether you think the fading or waning influence of Iran, given that Bashar al-Assad has fallen in Syria, given that Hezbollah has been significantly degraded, given that Iranian intelligence has been infiltrated to the degree it appears it has been, do you think a weakened Iran is less attractive to those who are perhaps on the fence in Iraq than perhaps an emboldened, more secure-looking Washington?
I think that a weakened Iran has created complications for some of the militias and political parties in Iraq that have either depended upon Iran in the past or got their training and their start with Iranian assistance. I think that, however, the Iranian Quds Force, the Revolutionary Guards, are by no means dead. And they had already given a significant amount of independence to some of the militias and political parties with which they worked very closely in the past. And I think that what that has done, among other things, has turned many of the Iraqi militias less from militias and more toward criminal gangs who have had to figure out how to raise enough money to pay their people and continue their operations. Through one set of reforms and the privatization of some state industries, however, the Mohandas Corporation, which is a legitimate company essentially run by the Popular Mobilization Forces, has begun to take up larger and larger shares of the Iraqi economy, at least the government-leaning economy, perhaps to look for a model like the IRGC in Iran, where there is significant IRGC influence on the economy, or even something similar to the influence that the Egyptian government and retired Egyptian military officers have on the economy, logistics, construction in Egypt. So there is a transition that gives greater economic power and essentially legitimate economic power to militias and political parties that have been close to Tehran. And this is probably the issue with which Washington is most concerned. They don't want to see pro-Iranian political parties, pro-Iranian militias gain greater economic support and be able to use that support to increase their own strength inside Iraq.
And how prevalent was this issue of Iran's sort of looming influence over Iraq and Washington's desired outcome that perhaps there be a decoupling between Iraq and Iran? How present was all of that on the campaign trail? Is it something we heard a lot from the candidates about during campaigning?
The answer is we heard a lot from some of the candidates about this, and we heard a lot about from the candidates essentially saying Iraq needs to be independent, that Iraq must define its own future, and it was echoing the slogans of Prime Minister Soudani. You have also heard from some Sunni candidates, from some Kurdish candidates, the desire for a closer relationship or a continued close relationship with the United States. And most of the rhetoric from the pro-Iran parties has frankly not been in favor of a close relationship to Tehran, but rather attacking what they see as a too close relationship with the United States. So it isn't an argument against should we be close with Iran, but rather we should distance ourselves even further from the United States. So there's a bit of subtlety in the argument. To be honest, in past election cycles, I think that both Washington and Tehran were a bit more engaged with candidates, a bit more engaged in talking to the ultimately elected members of parliament to encourage them to vote or to move the government in the direction that both Washington and Tehran preferred.
Let's talk about how the election went and what people were sort of thinking about as they cast their ballots. First of all, Muqtada al-Sadr, the influential cleric, I mean, has he lost some of his influence? Because he called on people not to take part. He called for a boycott in these elections. And yet it seems that that call for a boycott has been ignored because turnout, we're told, is 51%, and that compares, 55% comparing to 41% in 2021. Does that mean that Muqtada al-Sadr is not quite as influential as he used to be?
Well, I think that what you have is a pool of Iraqi voters that is significantly larger because, frankly, Iraqi voters who were born in 2007 turned 18 years old this year, and they are eligible to vote. So the pool of Iraqi voters now, I think, just barely surpasses 30 million people. The statistic that the Iraq High Election Commission released of a 55% turnout is 55% of Iraqi citizens who went to the trouble to get a new biometric election card for this particular parliamentary election. And there were about probably 9 or 9.5 million Iraqis who are eligible to vote, but through ignorance or protest against the elections themselves did not go to get the new election card. So if you look at how many Iraqis who were eligible actually voted, the number is closer to 40% than 55%, but that is still probably better than all the recent Iraqi elections.
Does that mean that Muqtada al-Sadr has lost influence, therefore, if people haven't heeded his call?
I think Muqtada al-Sadr lost a lot of influence after the 2021 elections. He won the largest block of MPs, and for a reason of protest and perhaps not understanding what his order to his MPs to resign actually meant, his MPs resigned from the parliament. It completely changed the structure of the parliament and brought into the parliament the second most vote-getting candidates. So he voluntarily, maybe consciously, maybe ignorantly, gave up a significant amount of power in 2021. I think that Sadr has always had a problem taking responsibility for governance. He is a much more effective candidate and politician as a gadfly from the outside. And I wonder if that is not part of the reason that he has asked his people not to vote this time. And he was quite serious. Apparently, 31 members of his party chose to register for the elections with other coalitions or other parties, and he expelled them from his own party. So I think that he was quite serious. What he will do, how he will try to influence elections, we don't know. It does not appear that he took any steps to create violence or disturbance before the elections at all. And most of what he engaged in the past few weeks was asking Iraqi voters, if they were to vote, to reject what he called illegitimate American presence in Iraq. So it wasn't even as strong an anti-American message as he has given in the past. So we will see if he wants to play a role in government formation, but without any MPs, I think that role, like the last time, will be significantly reduced.
Okay, in terms of the overall success of this election, although we obviously don't know who the Prime Minister is going to be, you know, there were very few cases of violence that were reported. There were some skirmishes in Kirkuk, I gather, and we spoke to someone overseeing the electoral process yesterday who said on the whole things had gone pretty well. So do you think it's fair to say that there is something to be celebrated here, that the sixth election since the fall of Saddam Hussein did go by largely peacefully, didn't they?
Well, I think that Iraqis are beginning to understand that this democratic process is part of the new culture of Iraqi society. The problem is, however, that a lot of Iraqis, maybe even a majority, have not been happy with the results of the governments that they have chosen. So I think that you can say that things are going a little bit better, and the fact of elections is something that Iraqis have gotten used to. But what Iraqis probably need to see now is a change in policy of the government if a new prime minister is elected. One of the odd things about the way that the Iraqi political system and choice of a president, a speaker of parliament, and a prime minister, which all come out of these same elections, is conducted, it's very bureaucratic. It's driven by the Constitution, but it has effectively produced a series of consensus Iraqi governments. The Shia community, once they know who has won the largest block of votes among Shia parties, begin negotiations to see whether or not the leader of that bloc will be chosen by the Shia parties collectively as the new prime ministerial candidate. That has almost never taken place. There has almost always been another candidate other than the leader of the largest bloc who has emerged as the choice of the Shia. And because of the way in which the bloc of Kurdish parties and Sunni parties have participated in the past, generally and almost always the Kurdish parties have waited for the Shia parties to decide who their candidate is and then chooses to support that candidate. The reason that most people want to support the candidate that the Shia parties choose and join a consensus government is that they all get to participate in government, in the distribution of government spoils, and it would be difficult for them to turn down that opportunity because they would simply be a parliamentary party in opposition. Now, personally, for me, I would like to see a Kurdish bloc, a Sunni bloc, a moderate, perhaps secular Shia bloc that would get together and form a majority government and leave more radical parties from any particular community in the opposition. But up to this point in Iraqi recent political history, that has not happened. I don't think that's going to happen this time around. But when the election results are out, if Prime Minister Soudani has a significant and very large plurality of votes, there is a possibility that Iraq could move in that direction. I doubt it with this election cycle, but that has been my hope ever since this started, that eventually you will see something that looks more like parliamentary formation in the UK, where you will have a majority coalition and a loyal opposition, and they will then conduct government using that structure.
And just lastly, Ambassador, and briefly, if you don't mind, I mean, almost every editorial I read about these elections in Iraq described them as being pivotal elections. Do you agree that these elections were pivotal? And if so, why were they so pivotal?
Well, it's hard for me to say, not knowing the results, how or why these elections are pivotal. If a majority government that leaves some political parties or even communities out of governance occurs out of these elections, it could be a pivotal result. But frankly, the issues that were covered in these elections, which were what is the value and the desire of Iraqis to have an American military or significant economic presence in Iraq, what do Iraqis think of the presence of Iran in the country? How are the political parties working with each other post-elections, and will a new prime minister choose to have much stronger parties, much stronger policies against corruption, and trying to keep the militias, which are theoretically under the prime minister's control, but operate often independently. These are the issues that are really salient for Iraqi voters, for the United States, and for Iran. If none of those issues really change in the way that the government deals with them, I wouldn't call these as pivotal elections at all.
Okay, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Thank you very much indeed for your analysis. Douglas Silliman, former US ambassador to Iraq. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Tom, very much.
Well, that is all we have time for this edition of Global News Today. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.